The wind whispered through the tall pines, carrying with it the crisp scent of autumn. The vast Montana sky stretched endlessly, a soft golden hue melting into the rugged landscape. At the edge of a quiet, forgotten town, nestled between the mountains and a river that never rushed, stood a small wooden house, weathered by time but strong, just like the man who lived in it. Walter Bennett sat on his porch, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, steam curling into the cool morning air. He was a man of few words, a man who had spent his life building things, houses, furniture, a family. Now, at 72, the only thing left standing was the house. The family was gone. His son had moved across the country, too busy with his own life to visit. His wife, Margaret, the love of his life, had passed away 5 years ago. Since then, loneliness had settled in like an unwelcome guest, one that never left. Walter had learned to live with the silence. He filled his days with routine, chopping wood, fixing things that didn't need fixing, listening to the old country records Margaret used to love. He kept the house in perfect order, not because anyone would visit, but because it gave him purpose. Yet, no matter how hard he worked, nothing filled the empty chair across from him at the dinner table. His only companion was the land. The trees didn't ask him how he was holding up, the river didn't remind him of time slipping away. They just existed, steady and unwavering. And that, in some strange way, was enough. But some days, especially in the early morning when the light touched Margaret's old rocking chair just right, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He missed the sound of another person's footsteps in the house, the simple act of having someone ask how his day was. He never said it aloud, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure how much longer he could go on like this. Then, one afternoon, something changed. A knock at the door. Not the mailman, he only came once a week. Not a neighbor, most had moved away years ago. When Walter opened it, he found Susan, a woman from town who worked at the animal shelter. She held a clipboard, her expression hesitant. "Walter," she said, offering a small smile. "I know you like your peace and quiet, but I think I have something you might need." He frowned. Not interested in buying anything. Susan chuckled. "It's not something you buy. It's something you save." She hesitated before adding, "It's a dog, Walter. An old one. No one else wants him." Walter stared at her, the weight of her words settling into his bones. He didn't need anyone. He didn't need anything. But as he looked past her, at the fading light of the day, a part of him, one he thought had long since withered, wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was right. Walter had never been much of a dog person. Not that he disliked them, he just never had the time for one. When he was young, he was always working, always building, always trying to provide. Later, it was Margaret who filled their home with warmth and companionship. Now, with her gone, the idea of bringing another living thing into his house felt foreign. But something about Susan's voice lingered in his mind. It wasn't pity, it was something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this world as he thought. So the next morning, against his better judgment, he found himself driving his old pickup truck into town. The road was familiar, but he hadn't had a reason to take it in weeks. The town itself had changed over the years. The old diner where he and Margaret used to have coffee had shut down. The hardware store had a new name on the sign. People walked past him without recognition, their lives moving forward while his had stayed still. The animal shelter sat at the edge of town, a modest building with a chain-link fence. The sound of barking greeted him the moment he stepped out of his truck. Susan met him at the front. "Didn't think I'd see you," she admitted with a knowing smile. "Neither did I," Walter muttered. "Let's just see the dog." She led him inside, past rows of kennels filled with eager, younger dogs, tails wagging, paws pressed against metal gates, eyes full of hope. But Susan kept walking, past them all, to the very last kennel. And there he was. A golden retriever, or at least, what remained of one. His fur, once bright gold, had faded to a dull, almost white color around his face. His body was thin, but not starving, just tired. He lay curled in the corner, eyes barely lifting as Susan approached. "This is Charlie," she said gently. Walter crouched slightly, taking in the sight of him. "Looks old." "He is," Susan admitted. 10, maybe 11. Found him wandering the highway. Probably dumped by someone who didn't want to deal with an old dog anymore. Walter frowned. "People do that?" Susan sighed. "More often than you think." He stared at the dog, at the way his chest rose and fell in slow, deep breaths. "Seems half dead already." Susan shook her head. "He's got some arthritis. Moves slow. Needs a little patience." She hesitated before adding, "Kind of like you." Walter shot her a look, but she only smiled. He turned back to Charlie. The dog was watching him now, really watching. His eyes weren't bright or playful like the others in the shelter. They were tired. Worn. But beneath all of that, there was something else. Recognition. Walter wasn't sure why, but he knew that look. It was the same one he saw every morning in the mirror. Slowly, he extended his hand. Charlie flinched, not out of fear, but as if he wasn't used to kindness. Walter kept still, letting the dog make the choice. After a long pause, Charlie stretched his nose forward, sniffing Walter's palm. Then, without warning, he let out a soft sigh and rested his chin on Walter's hand. Walter felt something in his chest tighten, something he hadn't felt in years. "He trusts you," Susan said softly. Walter swallowed. "He's a damn fool, then." But he didn't pull his hand away. By the time Walter signed the adoption papers, Charlie had barely moved. Susan helped him load the dog into the truck, placing a soft blanket in the passenger seat. As Walter climbed in, he glanced over. Charlie blinked at him, slow and steady, as if waiting for something. Walter started the engine, the rumble filling the quiet space. "All right, boy," he muttered, shifting into gear. "Let's go home." Charlie didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. But as Walter pulled out of the lot, the old dog did something he hadn't done in weeks. He closed his eyes and fell asleep, safe at last. The road back home was quiet, except for the occasional rattling of Walter's old pickup as it rolled over the gravel drive. Charlie lay curled in the passenger seat, his body motionless aside from the slow rise and fall of his chest. Every now and then, Walter glanced over at him, half expecting the old dog to start whining or shifting around, but he never did. He just rested, like he had finally let go of something heavy. Walter pulled into his driveway and killed the engine. The house, nestled in its usual solitude among the pines, stood unchanged. But something about bringing another living soul into it made it feel different. He climbed out, slamming the truck door shut. Charlie didn't move. Walter walked around and opened the passenger side. "Come on, boy," he muttered, patting his thigh the way he'd seen people do with their dogs before. Charlie didn't budge. Walter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Hell, I don't know how to do this." Gently, he reached in and lifted Charlie's front half. The dog didn't fight him, he simply let Walter help, shifting just enough to allow his frail body to be carried. He was lighter than Walter expected, his ribs barely cushioned by muscle. Whoever had abandoned him had done so long before his body had started failing. Inside, Walter set Charlie down on an old quilt by the fireplace. The dog let out a slow exhale and laid his head down. "Well," Walter muttered, hands on his hips. "Guess this is home now." Charlie didn't respond. The next few days were quiet, but different. Walter had been alone for so long that another presence in the house felt unnatural. The first morning, he nearly stepped on Charlie when he came down the stairs. He wasn't used to watching where he walked. The second day, he instinctively made only one plate of breakfast, forgetting for a moment that he had someone else to feed. By the third day, he had figured out Charlie's schedule. He didn't eat much, didn't drink much, and he didn't beg for attention the way younger dogs might. He was just there. And somehow, that was enough. Walter spent his mornings drinking coffee on the porch while Charlie lay beside him, watching the world with those old, tired eyes. In the afternoons, Walter would take slow walks down to the mailbox, Charlie trailing behind at his own pace, never in a hurry. At night, when the fire was lit, Walter would read the paper, and Charlie would sleep near his chair, his breaths deep and steady. The silence in the house was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't a reminder of absence. It was just peaceful. But it wasn't always easy. One night, as Walter was closing up for bed, he heard a strange noise, something he hadn't heard in years. A soft whimper. He turned, finding Charlie curled in on himself, his paws twitching in his sleep. The dog whimpered again, then let out a sharp, painful cry. A nightmare. Walter hesitated before kneeling beside him. "Hey, boy," he murmured, placing a hand gently on Charlie's back. The dog flinched but didn't wake. Walter's throat tightened. What had this old dog seen? Walter had seen nightmares before. After Vietnam, he'd had his share. There was a time when Margaret had to shake him awake, whispering his name over and over again until he came back to himself. He had seen what war did to men, but now, looking at Charlie, he realized something. Maybe suffering didn't belong only to people. Maybe dogs carried it, too. So he did what Margaret used to do for him. He stayed. He kept his hand there, firm but warm, until Charlie's body relaxed, his breathing slowing, the whimpers fading into the stillness of the room. Only then did Walter get up and go to bed. The days passed, and soon, something strange happened. Charlie started changing. At first, it was small. His tail, which had hung lifelessly behind him, started wagging, just once, just barely, when Walter walked into the room. Then, one morning, as Walter poured kibble into his bowl, Charlie lifted his head and actually walked toward him instead of waiting to be carried. The biggest surprise came one afternoon when Walter was in the yard, fixing the loose railing on the porch steps. He had barely noticed Charlie lying in the grass nearby, watching lazily. But then, without warning, the dog barked. It was short, hoarse, like he hadn't used his voice in a long time. Walter turned, startled. The hell was that for? Charlie's ears twitched. He didn't look afraid. And for the first time, Walter realized he looked alive. That night, Walter sat in his chair by the fire, nursing a glass of whiskey, Charlie at his feet. He ran a hand down the dog's back, feeling the warmth of him, the life in him. You ever hear the saying, old dogs can't learn new tricks? Walter murmured. Well, maybe that's a load of crap. Charlie sighed, settling deeper against Walter's leg. And for the first time in years, Walter didn't feel alone. The storm rolled in faster than expected. Walter had been watching the sky all afternoon, the heavy gray clouds creeping over the mountains, swallowing the last bits of autumn's golden light. The air had that sharp, electric bite to it, the kind that told an old man like him that something serious was coming. He had seen Montana winters all his life. He knew how fast a clear day could turn deadly. By evening, the first flakes had started falling, fat and slow, drifting lazily at first, then picking up speed. The wind rattled the windows, sending a deep chill into the bones of the house. Walter had stocked up on firewood earlier that morning, something Margaret would have been proud of. He stoked the flames now, letting the warmth spread through the living room. Charlie lay beside him on his old quilt, his breathing slow and steady, his head resting on his paws. "You ever see snow like this, boy?" Walter murmured, glancing out the window. Charlie flicked an ear but didn't lift his head. The storm was getting worse. By midnight, the world outside was a blur of white. Snow piled high against the porch steps. The trees groaned under its weight. Walter was about to head to bed when he noticed something. Charlie, still curled on his quilt, was breathing strangely. At first, he thought the dog was just dreaming. But when he knelt down, the slow rise and fall of Charlie's chest seemed wrong. His ribs moved unevenly, his breath shallow. Walter frowned. "Charlie?" The dog didn't open his eyes. A knot tightened in Walter's chest. He reached out, running a hand along the retriever's side. Charlie didn't flinch, didn't stir. His body was warm, but not the way it should be. Too hot. Walter had seen this before. Margaret's dog, years ago. When he had gotten old, when his body had started shutting down. The heavy breathing, the feverish warmth. It had been the beginning of the end. No. Not yet. Walter placed a hand on Charlie's side, trying to steady his own breathing. He wasn't a man who panicked easily. But this was different. He pressed his palm against the old dog's ribcage. The breathing was getting worse. Walter cursed under his breath and pushed himself up. He grabbed his coat off the chair, shoving his arms into the sleeves. His boots were next, the laces shaking between his fingers. The vet was in town. A 20-minute drive, on a good day. But in this weather? It could take an hour, maybe longer. He looked back at Charlie. The dog hadn't moved. Walter swallowed hard and reached for his truck keys. The storm was merciless. Walter could barely see the road. Snow swirled around the truck like a living thing, thick and blinding. The wipers struggled against the ice, each pass barely clearing enough space to see the faint outline of the trees. Charlie was in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket. His head rested against the fabric, his body unmoving except for the slow, labored breaths. "Stay with me, boy," Walter muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "You hear me?" The wind howled against the truck, pushing hard enough that Walter had to fight to keep it steady. "Damn it," he hissed. He couldn't turn back. He wouldn't. The thought of losing Charlie, of coming home to an empty house again, was unbearable. The truck's tires skidded as he rounded a bend. The snow was too thick. He could barely tell where the road ended and the ditch began. His hands ached from clenching the wheel. And then, the truck lurched. The back tires slid sideways, the whole vehicle shuddering as it skidded toward the ditch. Walter swore and yanked the wheel, but it was too late. The truck hit something, hard. The impact sent his body forward, the seat belt locking against his chest. The engine gave a final, pitiful sputter, then silence. For a moment, the only sound was the wind screaming outside. Walter sat there, heart pounding. His hands were still locked on the wheel, his knuckles white. Slowly, he turned his head. Charlie hadn't moved. Walter forced himself to breathe. Think. The truck was stuck. There was no getting it out, not in this storm. The vet's office was still miles away. And Charlie. Walter reached over, pressing his fingers gently against the retriever's chest. The breathing was even shallower now. He didn't have time. Walter shut his eyes for half a second, then reached for the door handle. The snow was up to his knees. Walter moved as fast as his body would allow, carrying Charlie in his arms. The dog was heavier than he looked, but Walter held him close, shielding him as best he could from the wind. His breath came in sharp bursts, each step harder than the last. The vet was out of the question now. But Susan. She lived closer. Just past the bend. If he could make it to her place, she could help. The wind howled around him, tearing at his coat, biting into his skin. His legs ached. His lungs burned. But he didn't stop. Charlie stirred against him, just barely. A faint sound escaped his throat, a soft whimper. Walter tightened his grip. "I know, boy," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I know. Just hang on." The world blurred. His feet slipped more than once, but he caught himself, pushing forward. Then, lights. Faint, but there. Walter gritted his teeth and pressed on. By the time he reached Susan's porch, he could barely lift his arms. He banged his fist against the door, his body trembling from cold, from exhaustion. The door swung open. "Oh my God, Walter!" Susan's face was a blur of shock and movement. Then warm hands were pulling him inside, taking Charlie from his arms. The heat of the house hit him like a wave. But all Walter saw was Charlie. Susan was speaking, something about blankets, about calling the vet, but Walter barely heard her. He sank into the nearest chair, his chest heaving. His limbs ached, his body protesting every movement. But Charlie was still breathing. Weak, but steady. Walter let out a slow breath, his hands shaking. He had made it. And so had Charlie. Walter sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that covered everything in sight. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the old clock above the sink. Charlie lay on a thick bed of blankets by the fireplace, his breathing slow but steady. The vet had come early that morning, checking him over, nodding approvingly. "He's weak," she had said. "But he's got fight in him. Give him time." Time. Walter had never thought much about time. He had always assumed he had more of it, more days with Margaret, more years to putter around the house, more mornings drinking coffee on the porch. But time had a way of slipping through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but memories and empty spaces. Except now, he wasn't alone. He glanced down at Charlie, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. He had been close, too close, to losing him. And for what? A quiet life? A house that had become a shrine to the past. Walter exhaled sharply and pushed himself to his feet. His body ached from the long night, but he ignored it. Instead, he walked over to Charlie and knelt down beside him. The old dog's eyes fluttered open, hazy but aware. "Morning, boy," Walter said softly. Charlie didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a slow, lazy wag. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess we're both too damn stubborn to quit, huh?" He reached out, running his hand along Charlie's back, feeling the warmth of him, the life still there. For the first time in years, Walter felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Gratitude. Not just for Charlie, but for the second chance life had given him. Later that morning, Susan stopped by, a bag of supplies in her arms. "You really scared me, you know," she said, setting down the bag with a huff. "What the hell were you thinking, walking in a storm like that?" Walter shrugged. "Didn't have much of a choice." Susan crossed her arms. "You could have called me." He gave her a look. "You really think I know how to use that damn phone?" She laughed, shaking her head. "Stubborn old man." He smirked. "Takes one to know one." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Charlie as he dozed. "You're different," Susan said suddenly. Walter frowned. "Different how?" She studied him for a moment. "Lighter. Like you're not carrying the whole world on your shoulders anymore." Walter didn't answer right away. He just stared at Charlie, at the old dog who had somehow managed to find his way into his life, into his heart. Maybe Susan was right. Maybe, for the first time since Margaret had passed, he wasn't carrying everything alone. Walter reached down and gave Charlie a gentle scratch behind the ears. "You ever hear the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks?" he asked. Susan smirked. "Of course." Walter smiled to himself. "Well," he murmured, "maybe that's a load of crap." Charlie let out a soft sigh, pressing his head against Walter's hand. And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like home. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the Montana sky in soft strokes of pink and orange. The world outside was still blanketed in white, but the warmth inside Walter's home was undeniable. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the small living room. Walter sat in his old armchair, a book resting in his lap. But he wasn't reading. His gaze was fixed on the dog lying beside him, his head resting on Walter's worn-out boots. Charlie had made it through. Not just through the storm, not just through the night, but through something much greater. He had found his way back from a world that had discarded him, and in doing so, had pulled Walter back from his own quiet, fading existence. Walter reached down, brushing his fingers gently through Charlie's fur. The old dog stirred slightly, one eye cracking open before sighing in contentment. For years, Walter had believed his life had already been written, that the last chapter had been written the day Margaret left this world. But now, as he sat there, feeling the warmth of a life he thought he had lost, he realized something. There was still time. Time to wake up in the morning and have someone there to greet him. Time to take slow walks down the old dirt road, even if they weren't as long as they used to be. Time to share quiet moments, to offer companionship, to matter to someone again. Charlie had needed saving. But maybe, just maybe, Walter had needed saving too. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Guess we saved each other, huh, boy?" Charlie's tail gave a single, slow wag. Walter smiled, looking out at the sky, the fading light of the day stretching across the land. Final message to viewers. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Sometimes, love finds us in the most unexpected places, in the quiet, in the stillness, in the presence of an old dog who just needs a chance. If you've ever thought about adopting a pet, consider giving a senior dog a home. They may have fewer years left, but those years can change a life. Just ask Walter. Just ask Charlie. Because sometimes, the best love stories start when we think we have nothing left to give.